So please welcome your next speaker, Managing Director at European Leagues, Jacco Swart, and he will be in conversation with the CMO at World Football Summit, Jaime Dominguez. Please welcome them on stage. Thank you, gents. Great to see you, Jacob. Jaime, muchas gracias. Over to you guys.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Jacco, it's great to have you here.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very nice to be in Sevilla, and it's very nice to be invited again by the World Football Summit, and congratulations with your great event.
Yeah, thank you. I'm personally looking very much forward to this conversation. I think we're going to focus on three key topics. Probably each one would do for a panel of its own, but we'll try to keep it, brief. But first, Jacco, I was wondering, can you share, because we have a very complex industry in Europe, with a lot of stakeholders. So I don't know if you can share with the audience here kind of an overview of that entire ecosystem and the role that European League plays in it.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Jaime. Yes, I mean, we could talk about football forever. In fact, you're talking here about football for already 2 days, and I'm working in this industry for more than 25 years already, and I'm talking about football and enjoying football for almost all my professional life. The limitation, of course, of our conversation is going to be that we can only address a few topics, but it's very good and clear that I can try to sketch the political landscape of European football in Europe, of professional football in Europe. And let me start by, you have a governing body, you have competition organizers, you have clubs, you have player representatives, you have the fans, and you have other, let's say, also political institutions more on either domestic or international level, like in, for instance, the European Union. The governing body in Europe is UEFA. And they are the ones who should take care of everything what is an interest in football, not only professional football, also grassroots, women's football, and other ways of how football is organized, for instance, futsal. Next to that, UEFA is also a competition organizer. They organize the competitions for their national teams via the qualification rounds, via the Nations League. We are just out of an international window over the last 10 days. And they also organize the international club competitions. So that's the governing body overlooking, let's say, the entire ecosystem in European football. And then below that, you have the clubs participating in competitions. You have the leagues, and let me start by the leagues, and I'll come back to that a little bit more in detail afterwards. The leagues are the competition organizers on a domestic level, and that's the body the European Leagues is representing. We are a membership association, and our members are coming from the domestic competition organizers, from La Liga in Spain, Liga Portugal, but also the Premier League, and also the Finnish Vijskausliiga, the Latvian League. So we have 38 leagues, which are coming from 32 countries, because in some countries, like for instance in England, you do have the Premier League, who only organize the top tier competition, and you have the EFL, the English Football League, who organize the professional football competitions on the lower tiers, the second, third, and fourth tier in England, and they are two separate organizations and two separate members in our associations. So we represent the domestic competition organizers all across Europe. Next to that, you have, of course, the clubs. And you have clubs playing in the domestic competitions. And some of the clubs playing in the domestic competitions, they have the quality because they win the championship, or they qualify, they end up second or third, or they win the domestic cup competition. So they qualify for a group stage or a qualification stage of one of the European club competitions, being Champions League, Europa League, or, and this has started last year, UEFA Europa Conference League.
Okay.
The clubs on an international level are represented by ECA, which is the European Club Association, but only those clubs who play on a more or less regular basis in one of the UEFA club competitions can become member of ECA. So they do not represent all clubs playing on a professional level in Europe, but they represent those clubs who play in the UEFA club competitions on a more or less regular basis. Next to that, you have the player unions.
Yep.
You have player unions in many domestic countries. You have one, a very important one in Spain. You have one in my own country, which is the Netherlands. But they are all member and part of the international player agency, not agency, player union body, which is FIFPro. And FIFPro is a global organization, a worldwide organization, but they have divisions, subdivisions more, let's say, on a continental basis. So in Europe, you have FIFPro Europe, and my colleague from FIFPro Europe, Joachim Maltins, supposed to be here, but he got stuck in air traffic, so he missed his connection coming from Amsterdam. He missed his connection from Madrid to Sevilla. So unfortunately, you have to deal with me only. And next to the player unions, I think what is also very important is to say that we have a growing interest of the fan organizations. And the fan are getting organized in a better and better way. And especially when we speak about fans here, we talk about fans who visiting matches in their stadiums, which is really important, of course, because we all discovered and experienced during COVID what football means without having fans in the stadium. Having empty stadiums and having matches, it's going to be for many fans going to be difficult to be as supportive to their teams as if compared to when they can follow the matches in the stadium of their teams. And besides that, of course, you have what I said before, you have the European Union and you have some other bodies, but I think for the picture right now, the overview right now, this is also where UEFA is mainly dealing with. So they're dealing with the clubs, they're dealing with the leagues, they're dealing with the player unions, and they're dealing with the fans.
And now that you mentioned UEFA, what is the visibility that you have across all the stakeholders? Is it the same across each one?
No, I don't think that all stakeholders are treated similar. And that they have similar relations. For instance, I believe that both the fan organizations as well as FIFPro, the player unions organizations, they do not have formal agreements with UEFA. Both ECA and ourselves, we do have a memorandum of understanding between UEFA and the respective association. But we see that there is quite a difference from our point of view in the content and the length and of the MOU between the agreement we have with UEFA and the agreements the clubs are having. And we think that UEFA, like the fan organizations and like the player unions organizations, should really understand, and that maybe they should even understand in a better way, that the leagues, the fans, and the players have similar interests as UEFA. We are also competition organizers, like UEFA is. And when you organize a competition, you have to represent the interest of everyone. You have to represent the interest of the big clubs in your competition, the medium size and the smaller ones, and everyone in between. And this is also whether you are organizing the Champions League, whether you are organizing the domestic competition in Spain, whether you are organizing this in some other country, or whether you are a player union. And because when you are a player union in a domestic country, you also have to deal with the top players who play at the biggest clubs and maybe who are ready to make a transfer to an even bigger club inside or outside the respective country. And you have to represent many of the players who will never grow to the level of being called up by the national team coach manager for the national team matches, for instance, or who never get the opportunity to play outside maybe their region, their country, or whatever. And this is the same for the fans. Also fans, of course, the fan organizations, they represent fans who support the big teams, who perform in all competitions, who could perform in the domestic competition, also in the international competition. And maybe the same fans, they also are supporting their national teams. But most of the fans, at the end, and most of the clubs, and most of the players, they have to support their club, they have to support their team. They play only in the domestic surrounding. They play either in the Liga or in the Dutch Eredivisie or in the Danish league or whatever. So there is a difference between stakeholders, and that's what we always say, and what I truly believe. If you look at the European Club Association, that's the association which represents, yes, they represent those clubs who play and perform on a more or less regular basis, and I said it before, in UEFA club competition, so in general, the biggest clubs in Europe and the biggest clubs in many of the domestic countries, but they do not represent all professional clubs.
Okay.
Only 96 today clubs participate in the group stage and further of the 3 international competitions.
Okay.
That will grow a little bit in the near future, but still it will be a very limited number compared to all the professional clubs which play in the domestic competitions all across our memberships and even beyond our memberships.
Okay. Well, thank you for that overview, because I was generally curious about that, and I could go down the rabbit hole of asking more questions, but as I said in the beginning, I want to focus on 3 key topics. I think, well, now that you were mentioning, we were talking about UEFA, one of them, or the first one, would be the match calendar, which is something that I think this year, because if it's a World Cup year and a, let's say, special World Cup year, because we're having it in November, I think it's worth talking about that. So now that that is fixed, because the calendar is fixed, what is your view on that? How is that process?
Yes, a lot of discussions start with a good discussion, let's call it that way, and finding an agreement on the match calendar, especially on the international match calendar, because finding an agreement on the match calendar means, in fact, finding an agreement on when which competition can schedule and play its matches. And these discussions on an international level start by defining the international match calendar. And the international match calendar, also that's important to understand, is in fact nothing more than putting into the calendar the windows for matches of the national teams.
Okay.
So the qualification matches, now we have this model in Europe of the Nations League, and the final tournaments. So you can imagine 2 things. When FIFA last year proposed that they thought it would be a good idea not to schedule the World Cup, which is the biggest tournament of national teams in the world, maybe it's the biggest, one of the biggest sports tournaments in the world, that they wanted to play this and schedule this once every 2 years, biannual, instead of once every 4 years, that everybody but FIFA, especially everybody in Europe, disagreed with that. Because it would definitely affect the match calendar. It would further limit, for instance, the domestic competitions, when they could play, when they can schedule their domestic matches. And sometimes people think that domestic competitions, that they have been taking up more and more and more dates over the last decades, over the last 10 years, last 20 years. But in general, I think, especially from the big competitions, from La Liga, from the Premier League, this number of new dates, putting and wishing to have additional dates into the calendar, is very limited. I believe that the format of the Premier League, since they started in 1992, is still 30 years later today, it's still similar. They have 20 clubs, they play 30 rounds, 38 rounds, round robin, and that's what they need for the Premier League. That they have also the FA Cup, that they have a League Cup, that makes it, of course, a little bit more complicated. So this biannual World Cup, that's one example I wanted to give. The other thing is, which is very accurate, because it's going to happen in more or less 6 or 7 weeks from now, that the World Cup in Qatar is going to start. First of all, let me say, when it was decided, that because we tend to forget soon, and sometimes it's good to look a little bit at the history books. When this was decided, and when there were already, of course, many questions. How is it possible that the World Cup is going to be assigned to Qatar? But when it was decided to play the World Cup as usually in June and July, in the summer. Soon after that decision, it became clear that it is impossible, and it was already clear before, of course, because there were all kinds of reports already, that it was impossible to play and schedule a World Cup in Qatar, in the Middle East, during the summer, because of the weather conditions, the high temperatures. it would be a challenge here in Sevilla, but you can imagine what the challenge will be if you want to organize matches like that in Qatar.
Yep.
So then, at the end, it was decided to switch the World Cup from summer to the autumn. It will start now the 18th of November, if I'm correct, or the 19th or the 20th.
Yep.
It means that for the first time ever, and we still strongly believe that this is the exception, this should be the exception, that's the first and only time ever, that the World Cup will start in November, which means that by mid-November, all the domestic competitions, all the clubs who provide the players to the national teams of the respective countries, and in Spain is one of the big examples, of course, where many La Liga clubs do not only have players who participate in the Spanish national team, but they also play in many South American, some European countries. So they provide players who play in La Liga, who are paid by La Liga clubs, and who have to stop their competition, and then the World Cup will be played, and it will end on the 18th of December. That's the date of the finals, and then competitions will resume again, and I believe La Liga will start again in January, beginning of January.
Yeah.
So they have a very long mid-season break.
It's
I
a
would
good
not
long
call
break,
it winter break. Usually, La Liga only stops, let's say, 2 weeks during Christmas, surrounding Christmas. So I think this is something really, and now we are focusing on those clubs and those players who are going to perform and going to play in the World Cup, which is of course interesting. But most of the clubs, also in La Liga, but all across Europe, most of the players are not going to travel to Qatar, are not going to be part of their national team squads. Only 32 countries participate. I'm not saying that I'm in favor of 48, but only 32 countries now participate. Times, I think everyone can bring 26 players. So let's say it's about 800 players who will be there. While we have about 10,000 professional football players in Europe. So 1 out of 10, in round figures, will only perform at the World Cup. What's happening with all the players who usually play during November and December and now have to take a mid-season break of 2 months? I mean, this is really affecting. The effect is that many competitions had to start early. They started earlier, so they started during the summer, let's say already in July, while they were used to play and to start and to perform their matches in August. They will have a long mid-season break and they will end late, and they will have to schedule more mid-week matches as well. So the importance of the match calendar is a very important topic for all competitions, not only for the biggest competitions with the most matches, but it's also good to understand that when we speak about the international match calendar, it's only about when are the national team matches going to be played, which windows.
Okay, so now just to finish the other 2 topics I want to cover briefly because we have more or less 5 minutes. The second one would be the revenue distribution, which is also another key topic that really is going to affect the industry. No? So I don't know if you can provide your views on that conversation, which is going to be becoming very relevant throughout the upcoming months. So
yes, revenue distribution. That's one of my favorites. And it's one of my favorites because this is really something what is very important for all competitions. In general, we believe that the more equal centralized revenues are distributed amongst clubs, the better it is for the competitive balance in each individual competition. And what do we mean by competitive balance? We are very much in favor of competitions where championships are decided in the final moments, and not the final moments of the last match before Christmas, but in the final moments in the last match of the season. We are very much in favor of competitions where you have matches with unpredictable outcomes, so that you have surprises, that a big team can be beaten by a smaller team, and that it can, of course, because every match starts with 0-0, but that it also happens in many competitions. We are not against the fact that Bayern Munich takes 10 times the championships in a row, but we would like to see that Bayern Munich only wins the title, the championship, in the final minutes of the season. So and distribution of money is very much helping in that. On this, you can, if we talk about revenue distribution, we mainly speak about the influence and the growing influence, the growing negative influence of the distribution model of UEFA club competitions towards clubs participating in the model. In the current situation, the current cycle, and UEFA club competitions are always sold in cycles of 3 years. Now we are in the middle of the cycle 21-24. For everyone's understanding, more than 2 million euros this season will be distributed amongst 32 teams participating in the Champions League. At the same time, only 175 million, which is a lot of money, but if you compare it to the 2 billion, it's not that much. 175 money will be distributed amongst hundreds of clubs all across Europe who do not participate in the competitions. And we believe, as one of our main objectives, that that should fundamentally change. That the level of the amount of money and the level of money which is shared, the level of the piece of the cake which is used for the non-participating clubs should grow much bigger than it is today. Today it's 5%, it should grow much bigger. I'm not saying any percentages, whether it should double, triple or whatever, but it should really substantially grow. We also see that the fact that this 2 billion is shared amongst 32 clubs only, that this gives such a lot of additional revenue to those clubs participating that they have a competitive advantage in their domestic competition. And this is on top of the fact that when you play in the Champions League, you already play matches against the best clubs in Europe, in the world, in fact. So your players are playing on the biggest stages, in the biggest stadiums. So the transfer value, this is what you see happening. The transfer values of players who have performed with clubs, who have played for clubs who played in the Champions League, have a higher value than similar players who haven't experienced matches in the Champions League yet. We also see at the biggest clubs that it provides them the opportunity to sign international sponsorship deals, which they all do in a very clever way, but it is widening the gap between those who participate and those who do not participate. And that means that it makes the risk that it makes the opportunity that someone will qualify for those competitions who have not qualified before, it will make it smaller and smaller again. So, and this is one of the things. So we have 3 objectives. One I already shared with you, that we believe that more of the cake should be provided to the non-participating clubs. The other thing is that we believe that within the competitions, money should be distributed more based on solidarity between the participants and based on sporting performance and not based on historical performances. And the third objective we think is that the level, there should be a better ratio between, there could be and must be a better ratio between what is shared to Champions League, what is provided to Champions League as revenues, and what is provided to the other competitions, be it Europa League and Conference League. Let me finish on this topic by saying one thing. Let's also not underestimate, this is not only an issue between, from my point of view, between the biggest clubs in Europe and all the others. This is also an issue in some of the smaller competitions. If you have a country like Latvia or now Lithuania, in Lithuania now for the first time ever a club qualified for the group stage of the Conference League. That is something they can really be proud of. The club, the league, the federation, everyone in Lithuania. But at the same time, the fact what they are going to earn in this Conference League is incomparable much compared to what an average team makes in the Lithuanian competition. So it can disrupt the competitive balance in their competition as well.
Unfortunately, as I said, I mean, we've run out of time, sorry, but that would have done for a completely entire panel. I want to thank you for the conversation and for the opportunity and you know, for joining us for the, and hopefully we will have another conversation in the future. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and it's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Jacob. What a passionate speaker you are. I very much enjoy listening to you. Thank you very much indeed, guys. Okay, right.